Hello and welcome to our keynote conversation format, a format where we invite several high-profile guests to talk about their work in combination with our festival topics. And I get the feeling today it will be a lot about digital democracy and democracy at all. And it is with pleasure that I introduce Amy Whittaker. She's an assistant professor of visual arts administration at the New York University. She studies the friction between art and business and proposes new structures to support economic sustainability for artists. Stemming from Amy's longstanding engagement in the social practice of teaching business to artists, her research has contributed to new methods of art market analysis that center artists and archival materials. These structures, in turn, inform policies of economic redistribution in democratic societies. Amy's work has been featured in Time magazine, The Guardian, Harper's, Atlantic, Financial Times, Art Forum, the New York Times, The New Yorker, among others. She's also the author of 3 books, Museum Legs, Art Thinking, and Economics of Visual Art, Market Practice and Market Resistance. Before entering academia, she worked for the Guggenheim, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Tate, as well as for the artist Jenny Holzer and the investment firm D.E. Shaw & Co. Amy holds a PhD in political economy from Goldsmiths, University of London, an MBA from Yale, and an MFA in painting from the Slade School of Fine Art, and also a BA in political science. To my left is Gerfried Stocker, and he usually likes it when I keep the introduction short. So we'll just say he's a media artist and a telecommunications engineer. He founded X-Space, a artist team and collective. And since 1995, Gerfried Stocker is the artistic director of Ars Electronica. And ever since, he's a key figure behind the artistic direction and positioning of Ars Electronica. So I welcome Amy Whittaker. Hello, nice to have you here.
Thank you, Alex.
Hi. So we go right into it. Somehow you're a wanderer between worlds, I would say. And then again, you're not, because you combine them so easily in your work, at least it seems to me. Not only, but especially, I think, in your book, Art Thinking, it seems somehow very natural that you would progress there from business and art, and you progress to this. So maybe you could, based on your personal and educational background, explain a little bit the topic of art thinking and what it is for you.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your generous introduction, Alex. And Gerfried has been describing these topics and at the forefront of developing pathways across these fields. So I'm so happy to be in conversation with you all. It's a very flattering way to start the Sunday morning in New York. So my own background, as you mentioned, is a bit of a Venn diagram. I wasn't one of those people who was blessed with an exactly specific interest. And so I studied a lot of things. And political science was really a home for me because the development of these systems of governance were ways of talking about how we could all live together in a society and a democratic society. So I noticed that many people, especially in business, which I had gone to study because I originally wanted to be a museum manager because I thought museums were like these public libraries for imagination. Many people in business seemed cut off from their creative selves. And many people in the arts seemed cut off from engagement in markets, not because they needed to make profit or think capitalistically, but because our societies had this engagement with markets that artists were disadvantaged from. And at the very least, I wanted to feel an invitation to participate in the conversation around. So as you said, I did an MBA and then I did an MFA in painting after that. And when I was in the MFA at the Slade, I used to give these lunchtime talks in business that were not how to get a gallery. They were, what is the theory of how the market works? And watching artists engage with that was absolutely amazing and a privilege. People would ask me questions like, what if we did away with all the banks? And I would say things like, you never have to open this section of the Financial Times again, but here are the stock pages, and here's how people believe that meaning is constructed through these systems. And so I have this sense of hopefulness that if anyone can help us navigate where we are in the world, how we might develop systems that are hopeful and just, I think that artists have every shot of doing that, and especially at this intersection of art and technology.
Thank you. When thinking about art thinking, at least for me, creativity in business as well, what always pops up, you know how the private business is very good at taking a certain part of a method and using it for furthering their capital and leave the rest, so to speak. So for me, at least art thinking, it felt, when I read it, it goes against the grain. It really goes against efficiency. It goes against building capital, so to speak. Because when I think about Silicon Valley, they always try to constantly better themselves and be creative all the time. But somehow I don't think that is the case with art thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe I can just give a short working overview of art thinking. You were kind of asking me to do that before. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, wrote an essay in 1947 called On the Origin of the Work of Art. And Heidegger says, when there is art that enters the world, a thrust enters history and everything is changed. The way that I would describe that is that if you are making a work of art in any area of your life, personally, professionally, societally, organizationally, technologically, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B. You are inventing point B. And exactly as you say, Alex, systems of economics are not designed for that process of discovery, invention, research, and development. They are designed for processes of production. The utopian belief of economics is that we have scarce resources and that markets can help us use them in the best possible way. And of course, we know that there are many things of value that markets struggle to describe. So what art thinking really offers is a way of thinking about a process of inventing point B. Similar to design thinking, it puts together creative and kind of structural practices, but different from design thinking, it breaks them out further apart. So there's more space for the messiness of artistic exploration and more engagement with business and economic structures as a parallel creative process. So, when we all listen to Gerfried's prescient talks over many years, and Gerfried, you talk about how companies and societies and countries can save money by being aware of privacy, for example, or surveillance and choosing what to invest in. That is very aligned with art thinking as a practice of having real discipline about deciding what the question is that you want to explore, whether you know that you can answer it or not. And then what's structurally difficult is that you have to invest resources in the question before you know if you will be able to answer it. And so you need systems to own equity in the future when value is discovered, and you need systems to cover R&D, research and development, when you're developing ideas. And so I think hopefully this process is very connected and resonant for this kind of larger exploration of democracy, developing the future, designing the world, because I think that ultimately we live in a series of point B worlds that are constantly being reinvented. And I think we would agree that we live in a quite vulnerable moment right now where we don't know what the genre of film is, of the world we're inventing. It could be very bad. It could be a horror movie. It could be the kind of French existentialist movie that just kind of slides into despair. I don't know yet, but this sort of engagement in the construction of really these kind of democratic systems is I think something we're all talking about working on.
Yeah. I really like, of course, this way how you coined this with inventing the point B as one of these really truly almost original artistic contributions. And sometimes I think we even could go maybe a little bit further and say what art thinking does is even inventing, accepting alternatives to a point B. Because it's not only to say, okay, well, I don't know point B, so we need to be creative to find another point B, because this is, I think, what the industry always would like to do us as creative people. You know, say, okay, we don't have a clue how to continue, so please help us with this. But I think the unexpectedness of these artistic contributions, the will to think in alternatives. And maybe if there is no point B, well, why should we invent even one? Maybe we should rather think of point C, D, E, F, G, or maybe even of, well, for a moment, let's stay where we are. And we maybe don't even have to go to point B. So this is, of course, the point where it really gets complicated. I think the moment where for us as artists and creatives, and I mean, you are also an artistic mind from your background. I always think the moment when it gets exciting for us, this is the moment when our clients or the people that we try to consult and help with art thinking, this is the moment where they get afraid of. What is your experience and what are your tricks, so to say, to build this bridge of confidence that the people that we're working with are really courageous enough to follow us in this alternative thinking?
Right, absolutely. I think you're so right that inventing point B, in some ways, it's a helpful, provocative concept, and in other ways, the alphabet is a linear structure. And the most important part is the part of being inside the point A world, you know, being alive to the present moment and being open to grounding ourselves in the questions that matter to us and the values that we intend to put forward in the world. And sometimes that absolutely means putting in a lot of work and care to maintain parts of the ongoing point A world, that it's not static, right? And then sometimes it means moving backwards, moving to the side. But the tools that I think are really helpful, you know, the art thinking book has two halves. The first half is about the mindsets of art, and the second half is about the tools of business, inclusive of some tools of democracy and politics relative to business. But on the art side, I think what's most helpful is first orienting to this kind of idea of being a whole person in the world, that nothing is wasted, you know, that we are alive to our own experiences. I was incredibly inspired by stories of people who thought all was lost, but actually discovered something indirectly, or a side piece of their life was actually extremely important to a discovery they made. And then being realistic and optimistic at the same time. So just orienting to the idea that most of the time when we see other people's breakthrough creative work, they've been struggling in obscurity for a long time before the moment we see. And there's that feeling that, you know, someone else is amazing and they have it figured out, but the bumper of my car is held on with duct tape. And so there are a number of stories in the book about that, about the differential between the process of how something is made and the outcome. And I often think in that context, when we start to talk organizationally about the work of Donald Wood Winnicott, the British child psychiatrist who studied children who were taken away from their parents during World War II. This is particularly in the United Kingdom. And what he found, he coined the term the good enough mother. I think we can all understand that in a less gendered way. But what it is for a person or for a creative being or idea to come into the world, and the necessity of safety around that as the idea goes from this sort of, you know, perfect form into kind of being part of reality, and how that happens. And the essence of Winnicott's work is the capacity for repair, and what it is to be in organizational settings where there's a capacity for repair. And I think that is crucial to how we think about teams getting comfortable with creative exploration and kind of where the rubber meets the road. I mean, one, I think you have to just say, okay, this question is important. This question is part of the portfolio of what we are investing in, but it's not something where we will measure the return in a tidy, quantifiable way. You might say this is the alternative asset allocation of what we're doing. And so we can have some control, we can structure experiments so that we're constantly learning, but we cannot benchmark this in a way that we understand. And we have to develop a culture of curiosity, of discipline to the question, of collaboration, so that we can each bring ourselves to it and find repair if we need to. And just to put that in slightly less abstract terms before kind of throwing it back to you, one of the characters in the Art Thinking book, among many others I have real love for, is Roger Bannister, the first person to run a mile in under 4 minutes in modern recorded sporting history. This is in 1954. And Bannister's story is emblematic of a few pieces of what I'm trying to get across. Number one, he was not a professional athlete. He was finishing his training to become a neurologist. And he always maintained that his greatest contributions in life were to neurology and to his family. But he only had an hour to train on his lunch break and then some time to train with his friends. Number two, he didn't do it alone. Two of his friends who were outstanding runners in their own right, one was a world record holder, one co-founded the London Marathon, paced him. Number three, there's nothing perfect about the circumstances in which he did this. It was a terrible day. The weather was bad, even by British standards. There was a false start. He almost wasn't able to do it. And he had to give everything he had before he knew it was possible. So this portal of the ordinary and extraordinary is very close. And then number four, when he did this in the point A world, no one believed it was possible. They thought he might die trying. They thought the other runners who were trying to do this at the same time might die trying. They had pre-written obituaries. And then he did it. And then he only held the record for 45 days, because to believe something is possible that you've never seen and do it is extremely different from seeing it's possible and trying to best an effort. And this economic logic is the latter. It's, can I be marginally more efficient at producing this thing that I already see is producible? And so art thinking is really holding space for the Bannister part of that. And I think for all of us, sometimes we need guardrails to do that. In Bannister's case, he had run in the Olympics in Helsinki in 1952 and come in fourth and been devastated not to medal. And he had given himself a grace period. He had said, I have 2 years and then I will have finished my medical training and I really won't be able to run at this level. And, you know, July 1952 to May 1954 is almost 2 years. So sometimes we need that grace period. We need to say, this is the amount of time I can train. This is my studio time. I can't do more than that. This is the amount I can invest that I can afford to lose or treat as a tuition for learning. And this is the period of my life in which it's safe for me to hold and protect this open-ended space. And these are the people I'm working with, and we cultivate enough trust in each other that there's a capacity for repair, what Winnicott calls a holding environment.
I really would like to progress this a little bit further, because this in itself is a very democratic act and a very democratic notion of art. And somehow I want to flip it onto the art world and the art business now. I have a little anecdote. I am not sure if it's true. I didn't check it because I want it to be true. So supposedly Joseph Beuys said to one of his students, in principle, everyone is an artist except you. And what seems like an insult quickly turns around and makes this person very special and a genius. And what I like about it is you have both notions of art as something democratic, which is in the world, which is a basic human trait, and then you have this idea of a very special person. And my question would be, do we have in the art world too much still the notion of the artist as something special, and how can we bring more participation in the open notion of art into the structure in museums, in institutions? Are there any technical tools or new developments?
Gerfried, did you want to take that first, or either way?
You are our special guest. Please
No,
start.
it's,
Please start.
no, it's my honor to be in conversation with both of you.
My remark would be to this as a starting point is, I think we have to make a difference between what is art, what is the artwork, and what is the artist, and what is the artist's work. And I think the artist's work is not necessarily the artwork on its own. There is much more that you need to do as a work, as an artist, and also much more of an impact that the work of an artist is creating than just the artist is not only the producer of an artwork. The artist's work is not just only the process to create or produce an artwork. And then I think it immediately becomes for me much clearer why in the same time you can really push for this democratic approach towards art, but still, of course, see the achievement of individuals who we call artists and who practice artistic work as something extremely rare, special, and valuable.
Yeah, I love that. And I kind of riff off of that. I have some similar ideas. So I think because we're talking in a democratic context, and forgive me my US context within that, I would be the first to say that the American democratic experiment is extremely challenged at the moment. But if you go to the foundational documents of it, there's a value placed on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that type of concept, pursuit of happiness, is very much how I think about everyone being an artist in the Joseph Beuys sense, except that one student, of course. The idea is that we're not all artists. We all have an invitation to the pursuit of art. We all have innate creativity and the potential to make a unique contribution. And that, to me, is the kind of two-sided coin of optimism and respectfulness or dignity of what each person is in a democracy. And I think what happens is that the democracy, and again, I'll just speak about the United States as a case study. In the United States, there's no control around campaign finance, especially with a recent Supreme Court case called Citizens United. Corporations are considered people, and spending money on campaigns is considered free speech. And so what happens is that we have what the political economist Will Davies at Goldsmiths, my PhD advisor, calls the disenchantment of politics by economics. So we have this idea of participation that is actually participation in markets, that's not participation in civic life, and is not participation in bringing forth one's creative self. So in my opinion, what we need most to democratize this idea of everyone being an artist is this kind of degree of honesty and transparency about how vulnerability is probably the first step in that. That when you're making a work of art or you're trying to figure something out you don't know how to do, you're in the weeds, right? You don't have this view out the airplane window where you're perfectly oriented and you're like, oh yes, there's a vista around that corner. You're just putting one foot in front of the other. And that can be really frustrating and uncomfortable, but the alternative is kind of not being alive to your own life, right? So it's kind of this idea of being in the weeds as being alive, I think, is the first thing that we can really normalize. And then I think also these questions of relationship, the power of conversation, the necessity of building things that are larger than ourselves with other people as collaborators. I think we don't have a lot of space for that, because even within the arts, the economic kind of concept of the artist focuses on the lone individual and tries to kind of have superstars who are kind of market darlings. And I think there's a lot of space that's opening up in part because of technology, including blockchain, but other technologies as well, where there are ways that people can come together in cooperatives, in collective investment trusts, in what in the blockchain sense are decentralized autonomous organizations, so that people can make decisions together and support each other and distribute surplus across groups. And I think some of that will reanimate the democratic experiment. And in my ideal world, the arts becomes a hub for interdisciplinary problem solving and models of redistribution, solidarity economies, mutual aid that are developed in the arts well under the cloud layer of the shiny, glittery art market among artists, that those things can become models for larger parts of our societies.
I would like to continue here with the blockchain technology, but what the heck is blockchain? I mean, I get it I somehow expected to go up in flames saying this in Ars Electronica. No, I get it on a technical level, but once you fathom the possibilities of this technology, what you can do with it, it somehow, you immediately want to put a label on it. You want to say it's neoliberal, you want to say it's anarchist, you want to put a label on it. And then I thought, in comparison to AI, there is almost no discourse on blockchain, maybe a little bit on Bitcoin, but it seems very tech savvy. Maybe we could go a little bit more into the potential of this technology.
Maybe, and leaving aside the blockchain, of course, has this huge problem with being an energy consumer that is way beyond reasonability. Let's assume that in a certain amount of time, technicians are able to solve the problem, and let's even assume blockchain could be easily created, so that we can really focus on, I think, its potential to become a really new player or a new driving force in the way how economic relationships are created. Because I totally agree and I support this strong criticism about the way how blockchain is now implemented technologically. But the problem is it turns away the attention from the much bigger issue, and this is really this shift of paradigm in economic relationships. So,
absolutely, absolutely. I think the way that I see a lot of people encounter blockchain is it's like they've asked the question, what is blockchain? And the answer is like, oh, don't worry, it's too complicated technologically. And it's so fancy and important. Like it's going to be the future, and like, very kind of like exuberant and dismissive, and, don't worry, you're, about the technology, it's above you. And I don't feel that way about it at all. And I'm actually in the middle of creating a series of programs around it. They'll air at 1 a.m. Central European time, but they'll be recorded. So hopefully there'll be some follow-up to what I'm about to say. So blockchain has a lot of different stories that come together. There's obviously a money story, cryptocurrencies. There's a technology story about what the blockchain is. There's a democracy story about how we might all interact. There's some art stories and artist stories. But the one I always start with is the knowledge story, because, and I'm actually filming with these gentlemen yesterday and today, later today, US time. The start of the blockchain is actually in a question, so like an inventing point B kind of question from the late 1980s, when people were starting to get personal computers at home and in offices. And the question was, it is so easy to manipulate a digital file. How will we know what was true about the past? And this is the democratic part. How will we know what was true about the past without having to trust a central administrator to keep the record? So why is that important? It's important because a central administrator could theoretically be corrupted, the same way that a philosopher king could be corrupted. And so that's why we have trust in a system of people. So these researchers, Stuart Haber and Scott Stornetta, who are working at it's called Bellcore, a research lab of telephone companies consortium in New Jersey in the United States, they were trying to figure this out, and they could not figure it out mathematically. And then they looked at what the challenge was. And the challenge was, like, if you have 2 copies of the record and a third person corrupts it and so on, ultimately you have all these different people and anyone could really pose a threat. And then what happened was they said, actually, we can turn that upside down. And if anyone could pose a threat, then everyone can keep the system safe. We don't need to have this one copy of a record. We need to have many, many interconnected copies of a record. And if we do that, then we can trust a system and trust the information in the system without having to trust a central administrator. There's some very specific pieces of the cryptography that make that possible. And It's a combination of public-private key encryption and one-way hash functions and a couple of other things. And if anyone wants to read about that, there are a couple of really great books. I actually have one on my desk right now. This is by Narayanan. This is a Coursera course. And I can email you some links. But basically, it comes about from a question of knowledge and shared understanding, pre kind of fake news or people living in different realities of information. And so what's interesting about blockchain is that it allows us to know what's true in collaboration with each other. And it allows us to register ownership, including shared ownership, in a lot of new ways. So we've seen this develop in the arts through non-fungible tokens, where artists have digital work and they can represent an original copy of it, an investable copy of it, using registration to the blockchain. But we're seeing a lot of systems come out of that where people use aspects of blockchain in order to structure decision making. So people talk about this, the Bitcoin blockchain was followed by the Ethereum blockchain protocol, and Ethereum is based on a concept of tokens and smart contracts that move those tokens around modularly. So a smart contract is a self-executing contract. So you can specify certain terms. If I sell a work of art, 20% goes to a charity. If Gerfried resells the work to Alex, 10% of it comes back to me. You can automate those processes without overhead and transaction costs in a blockchain world. You can also just know the record. You can see that it was sold. You can see the title transfer. You can imagine those systems being applied to voting or to something like self-sovereign ID cards for refugees who are not in a nation state. So they can have identity and autonomy that pertains to themselves, not just that's conferred by, again, a central administrator of a government. And then what we're seeing develop now, and is really exciting and is happening across a lot of artists and technologists, is these governance systems. So let's say that we have an entity that sells a lot of artworks and makes money. A lot of that may go back to the artists who make the work, but some of it is also a surplus that can be shared across the group or invested in new projects that the group believes in. And that is a governance problem of how that money is distributed. So blockchain can also make these much more dynamic and complex sort of smart contracts that are called DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, where everyone's vote is mapped like a democratic system, but kind of technologically inculcated and governed. So what people are working on structurally within blockchain, some of it's so idealistic and could easily be regulated or limited out of existence by governments or companies. But it's so important as an active question, as an art project that all of us kind of live inside right now. And I'd love to hear kind of what you're thinking, and if there's anything I'm saying that's maybe abstract or not clear that I can clarify.
To me, it was clear. I get the idea of, for example, that it's good for provenance and stuff like this. But let us, for example, speculate a little bit and don't worry about feasibility too much. But it's a very decentralized technology. So let's imagine, for example, a festival that is totally produced via investment through decentralized investors via blockchain. Let's say that's possible. So you being here is by decentralized investors, you being here by decentralized investors, me being here. So what popped up in my mind, it's a very different notion. So there is no, an art institution also is a gateway. So it's a very contrary to existing centralized platforms as governments or even museums. So for me, the question would be how to balance between this, because we of course need also experts in a way, and how to balance governance in this area.
I mean, what I don't like actually so much in particular when it comes to the NFT discussion now in the art world is that, of course, this whole frenzy about the blockchain is so much connected to unquestioned understanding that the things of the world are there to be bought and sold and sold again, and somebody makes a profit, sold again, somebody makes a profit. So of course, if this is anything we can ever think of as human society, well, then the blockchain is a great thing, because it decentralizes things, it also creates wonderful possibilities for autonomous business made between machines. So what else could be better for the capitalists of the future, that they don't even have to think of their stock exchange anymore, things like this. Their machines, their artificial intelligence is making their money for them. So on the one side, it's such a kind of inspiring technological development, but it totally ended up in repeating very problematic paradigms of how economy of human societies can work. And then we see this in a moment of time where, or we are in a moment of time where we exactly see where this brought us. I mean, the whole thing that we have now with our climate crisis is, of course, because of an understanding that there is an endless source of things that you can own, and you acquire it, or you colonize it, or whatever you say to it, and, well, you make money by controlling the way how it's being sold. So in this moment, I think that the real problem of blockchain isn't even the problem with the energy waste, the amount of energy, because I'm sure this can be solved technically. I believe in technology can do this. But can we also fix this very stupid unilinear thinking of the way we make business as societies? And
yes.
That's what I'm really sorry, because I think in the beginning, when blockchain started to be also recognized in our artistic, cultural, alternative hacker communities, it was so much, I think, inspired that this would change the way how we think about economy, and not just be a more efficient tool to do the same type of economy.
I could not agree more with your articulation of the question. So if I start at the beginning of what Alex said first. Alex, you've exactly described the core problem of democratic governance, which is the balance between popular votes and an elite insulated judiciary. How you have some determination by all of us and some determination by those who are most expert and informed. In this case, it's very difficult to understand blockchain technologically or to program it. And so how do we combine these things? I always think of it as the Bodie McBoatface problem or opportunity. After, I think in the UK, there was a boat that the government allowed the public to name, and the public voted that the boat should be named Bodie McBoatface, which is kind of amazing. And also you recognize the power of popular will. So I think that in the case of these kind of economic structures and how they're being replicated in the blockchain, to me, I just want to say the best way I can describe this is to say that I am working actively and will be for the next decade and have been for the last decade at least on ways that we can think about ownership and equity as enabling. So this is very problematic as a starting point. I'm speaking from New York City, which is stolen Lenape indigenous land. So ownership is a concept that requires a lot of unpacking and some repair work. So I'm also speaking with knowledge and respectfulness toward that. But I want to talk from this perspective of artists as a starting point, because I think that equity is a very important underused political tool, and that there's a lot of creative policy design that can come from being extremely disciplined and then subsequently imaginative about the difference between equity and handouts or just payments, things that exist in an investment world and things that exist in a transaction or economic or income statement world. So some of the work that I've been doing research-wise is on what would happen if artists retained fractional equity in their work when it's first sold. And I think this describes the problem, which is that take even famous artists like Jasper Johns or Robert Rauschenberg were making work early on before anyone thought it was valuable. They were investing resources in a point A world in the 1950s before anyone bought anything. if you look at that work, if you go to archives and look at the sales records, what you can see is that if those artists had kept 10% equity, so instead of getting paid $100, they got paid $90 and then owned 10% of the work. So they paid for the equity and foregone income. They would have outperformed US equities markets by up to 1,000 times, or a 20 to 40% return every year from roughly 1970 to 2005. Now, that sounds like a really capitalistic neoliberal thing to say, but what's interesting about it is that if you can get artists together in a portfolio of people where some are quite powerful and financially successful, and some are just starting out, they're in that moment of having to invest to cover the research and development, you can create redistributive systems. If everyone owns a share in this kind of entity, some of the proceeds from those who are more successful can go to support those who are just starting out. That's the governance question of how to redistribute proceeds. And I think that with increasing income inequality being one of the destabilizing influences in politics, in and of itself, and also in political strategy, where people who are wealthy and racially privileged will often find people who are not wealthy and racially privileged and invoke racism to try to form an alliance to support their wealth. Those and many, many, many other strategic variations on that. If you can imagine a democratic system where we have equity-based systems of redistribution, where people own things together, there's less pressure on elected representatives to choose the amount that they give to people. They can't say, here's $650 and you're welcome, and that should cover your rent for the next 6 months. You own a share. So if there are proceeds, it's governed by the system. You own a percentage of what happens, almost like a dividend. So I think that equity is an extremely underexplored structural policy tool with regard to reparations and redistribution. And I think that taxation of transactions is much more effective or actionable from a policy standpoint than taxation of wealth. So I think that there are ways that we can construct the economics to form what the blockchain collective data calls an invisible economy, an economy that it's both hidden and more transparent underneath the things that we actually value. So I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not inherently interested in watching an NFT sell for a lot of money at all. And I say that as someone who used to watch this American game show obsessively called The Price is Right, where you try to guess what things cost. And I used to be really good at that. And I am terrible at guessing the price of an NFT, partly because I don't care. I care that people can make things of value and that those things can come to exist in the world. And I think a lot about the invisible opportunity costs of what doesn't get made and of who cannot be an artist because of the economics of it. So, live and let live. If someone makes a lot of money in the market, fine. And if someone makes a lot of money in the market who's created a lot of value and contributed to other people, fantastic. But I think that ultimately value is really the driver of what markets can contribute. And we don't think about it. We just think about price. We just think about the shiny number on the front of the newspaper. But I think we have to really reorient to value. And then I think a lot follows from that.
Thank you very much. We could talk, I think, 1 hour more. It's just very
scratching on the surface.
Scratching on the surface. Yes, and I like the approach to give artists more economic stability. But I'm afraid we're out of time. And I thank you very much for being here for this interesting talk, also to you. And I'm saying goodbye and hand over to my colleague.
Well, thank you, Alex Ferran, Gerfried Stocker, and Amy Whittaker for this interesting talk you had.
Thank you.